Hello and welcome to a special edition of the 11th OVC. Here we actually came to the famous Fort Laramie along the confluence of which two bodies of water?
The Laramie and North Platte Rivers.
The Laramie and North Platte Rivers. We actually did a drill today for our unit, and we wanted to take the time to actually kind of talk about this famous or infamous fort and really the value that this fort brought to the West. Our friend, Mr. Brandon Lewis, actually used to work here. He started his historic career, and in both senses of the term, historic career here at Fort Laramie as a volunteer, and then later as a intern, right?
Intern, and then with a seasonal with the National Park Service.
Well, that's great. So what we're going to do is let's just have Brandon talk about what Fort Laramie is, how it started, and why especially has a specific place in our heart with the 11th OVC. So, yeah, how'd it start here?
So there's a long history with Fort Laramie, and originally it was a fur trading post built by the American Fur Company in 1834. It was known as Fort William, and it had cottonwood a stockaded log wall around it for protection, and it was a really important fur trading post in the area. But very quickly on, the walls started collapsing in on themselves and rotting out, and so they moved it and they built what was known as Fort John in 1841. That was a little further upstream in a different location, we believe, and it actually was at the end of the parade ground here. The remnants of it are still down there.
We actually, one of the earliest photos of Fort Laramie have the remnants of Fort John.
Yeah, the crumbling adobe walls are starting to fall apart as well, and they actually used it as the post hospital when the military moved in and took over.
Did they really?
So,
okay.
Yeah, I did, but I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah,
but so it's still run as a fur trading post, just a slightly different location, and now they've upgraded to adobe walls, and it's slightly larger. And then, especially as you get towards the late 1840s and 1849, you have gold found in California with the gold rush,
right.
And you have lots of people headed west. You have people going towards the Mormon Trail coming through to go to the land of Zion out west. You've got
the main trails. You got the Oregon, the Mormon, and the California.
Yeah, so the three major trails all came through this area, and this was a very important location, and why everyone's starting to gather through here, or pass through here, excuse me, is because it's the river bottoms. You're following water, and you're following the terrain as you're headed west. And so this was a very important stop, because this is the last place that you could stop and rest and resupply before you start getting to the Rocky Mountains. So you definitely wanted to get here in time, and later on it was before the 4th of July.
Yeah.
You wanted to be at Fort Laramie before then, because if you didn't get here at that time, the passes are going to snow closed, and you would either die or get lost, and you'd have to be turned back. And the Army was actually told to turn people away.
Back, yeah.
That was one of their roles. But anyway, so everyone's starting to head out west, and you're seeing a lot of traffic through here. And a lot of the tribal organizations in the area are not overly fond of everyone passing through the middle of their hunting grounds and disrupting and getting into a little bit of friction with them. And so the government's going to send the U.S. military out, and they're going to establish what would later become Fort Laramie. And they purchased Fort John. They started out there, but very quickly they found they couldn't fit all of the buildings they required into one little area. Right. And so you start to see structures added on over the years. And one of the first buildings that was constructed was actually the one that we're sitting on the porch of right now. This is Old Bedlam. And this was the commanding officers' quarters, and it was also bachelor officers' quarters, depending on what years you're talking about. And it got the nickname Old Bedlam supposedly because of the raucous parties that the bachelor officers were having. There was a lot of wild noises coming out of here in the evening. And they'd throw lots of parties, being young officers that they are, and it sounded like chaos. It would sound like Bedlam, which was a reference to the insane asylum back in London. So that's kind of how it got its name. But this building was actually constructed in 1849, the same year that the military is going to move out and purchase Fort John, and they'll officially designate it as Fort Laramie, or Fort on the Laramie River, is basically what it was originated with.
So that means, 49, so that means but Bedlam here, this building, is one of the oldest buildings in the state of Wyoming. Well, ended up being the state of Wyoming, but was one of the oldest buildings in the state.
That's documented.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a lot of history here.
So much history.
One of the things that they always like to talk about, and a lot of history enthusiasts will mention, is that right after the Fetterman Massacre, Portuguese Phillips was the messenger that was paid to basically run through the blizzards and get straight from Fort Phil Kearny up along the Bozeman Trail. And he rode right here, and as the story goes, he basically would have his horse collapse dead directly in front of on the parade grounds and in front of Old Bedlam, and he comes rushing in and would deliver the bad news to the commanding officer at the time and pass the news on.
Yeah.
So
no, and of course the tie to the 11th Ohio is then in 1862. The 11th Ohio, which was originally designated the 6th Ohio, until they had some squabbles between a couple different colonels, and they had the William Collins with the 6th Ohio, 1st Independent Battalion. They were sent out here. They wanted to fight the Civil War, but they were instead sent out here. To fight Indians instead of
Indians,
rebels.
And instead of fighting in the Civil War, you're going to be escorting mail along the trail to the various posts. You are going to be protecting what little immigrants are going to be passing along the overland trails, and you're going to be especially maintaining the telegraph wires, which is the connection of communication between back east in Washington and the West Coast.
Yeah, and so they came out here in 1862, and at least the 11th Ohio did. And they were, this is kind of like the hub, the central command area for the entire region. Go ahead.
Yeah, this was the regimental headquarters for the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, right out of the office directly behind us in the window here.
How it's currently portrayed is the office behind us is what?
That would be the administration, paperwork is all done there. So it's interesting. So the way that the National Park Service has set up Old Bedlam is to give you several different eras to observe.
Right.
So if you go in right now and you look on the right side of the building, that is set up during, I believe it's the early 1850s, and that is bachelor officers' quarters in the earlier years of the fort. And so you can see how these younger officers are going to be living, and usually there's going to be a couple officers sharing a room just because there's not a lot of buildings out here at the time. And they're definitely not going to be sharing the same building as all the enlisted men in the barracks that would be constructed.
Exactly.
But on the left side of the building, that's behind us right here, this is going to be in the 1860s, set up as post headquarters. And so the office directly behind us is where all your paperwork is going to be done. All of the orders that are going to be written, they're all going to be going out and distributed to the various commands along the overland trails, which is basically going to be from around, I believe it was Mud Springs and a little ways, what would be into Nebraska.
Mud Springs in Nebraska.
And then it would go essentially all the way over to the western half of Wyoming nowadays, over South Pass, so there's a lot of territory that the 11th Ohio will have to cover. And so all the orders that were sent out came out of the building behind us. And then further back, as you continue in, they have the court-martial room. So that's where all your disciplinary work is going to be done at the fort. So if there's soldiers that have gotten into mischief, basically the judgments would be in trials would be carried out behind us there. Now upstairs, it is also set up as Colonel William Collins's personal quarters. Him and Mrs. Collins would have had the room upstairs, so that was their living area.
Yeah. Now, what's also interesting about Fort Laramie is you'll see ruins of either burned out or destroyed or just disintegrated buildings here. What are these buildings? Or I guess when you come here to Fort Laramie, you see Old Bedlam, which is not restored, but a preserved building that looks as it pretty much did in a certain period of time. But then you have ruins over there. You have you could tell a building over there, but there's nothing inside. It's gutted. What are we seeing here at Fort Laramie?
So one of the interesting things is it started as a military post in 1849, and it is going to remain in operation until 1890. So that's 41 years as a military post. And you can imagine technologies change, sizes of garrisons here are going to change. So the fewest men you would have, I think, around 50 or a little under in the 1850s, and you are going to see as many as, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's around 700. It's been a while since I worked here. I want to say it's around 700 men that were stationed here. Plus, in the campaign of '76, you have other troops that are passing through to head north on the Powder River to head up with General Crook.
Yeah. Actually, reminding that, let's go backwards to 1865. During the bloody summer of 1865, obviously you had Battle of Platte Bridge, Red Buttes, all the violence along the Platte River. But you also had the Powder River Expedition, not of the 70s, but the Powder River Expedition of 1865. And they, one of the wings came out of here. And so I'm assuming at that point in time, right before they left, there would have been obviously a surge of soldiers during that time frame.
So anyway, back to the buildings though, you're going to see they're going to expand and build as they are needed, more of those structures. And so you are going to see 41 years of a variety of different styles of structures. A lot of them are going to be officers' quarters. Some of the ruins, you would have had infantry barracks on either side of the parade ground. And you're going to see, so earlier buildings would have been made out of adobe, lumber like what we see behind us here, but you also are going to see a lot of the buildings nowadays are made out of what is called lime grout, and it's essentially an early form of concrete out here, and it's done pretty well holding up to it.
Yeah.
The Park Service has done a wonderful job of maintaining these structures so that we can enjoy them today. But the ones that you see currently that you can go into and are refurbished as they would have looked back in the day, they were actually utilized after the military left. So when they decommissioned the post in 1890, you see all the buildings are stripped of anything useful, floorboards, doors, that sort of a thing. A lot of the stuff is auctioned off to the homesteaders in the local area. Right. And even to this day, I grew up out here. A lot of the locals in the community, they have little bits and pieces of Fort Laramie history, and part of their barn used to be part of a barracks floor, or something like that, and or furniture that was auctioned off. You'll still find bits of that in the local lore of the area, which is really cool and very special. But the structures you can go into today, they were utilized. People moved into them. One of the bakeries was utilized as a barn, and the guardhouse was used as a barn for a while. They would actually they cut holes in the floorboards and shoveled hay from upstairs down to where the livestock were downstairs. And then when the Park Service took over in the 1930s, you're going to see they start to refurbish these structures, and they will furnish them as they would have looked, or as close as they can get to the descriptions that they are recorded.
Yeah. So let's close with another fun tidbit or piece of trivia about Fort Laramie, and more importantly, the commanding officers that came through Fort Laramie that have a specific tie or connection to Gettysburg. What is the Fort Laramie connection to Gettysburg?
Well, the biggest one that comes to mind is that for a while, Garnett was actually a post commander.
Right.
And he being the famous one that he decided to ride his horse, and he was never found at Pickett's charge. He was essentially, I believe, incinerated by canister, and they never found him. But his horse had a bloodied saddle, I think. Yeah,
so exactly. It's the Confederate General Garnett that was, made famous in the American Civil War. Killed at Gettysburg. He actually was stationed here before the war. So, and beyond Garnett, we actually have, a fair amount of other officers that came through Fort Laramie. Really, because Fort Laramie was such a key to the West, we had so many of the who's who of officers of the Civil War that beforehand, in the late 50s, the mid 50s, even in the early 50s, they kind of came through right here where we're sitting. So, yeah. So with that, I think that's plenty for now. We'll go ahead and end it here. If you ever get a chance to visit Fort Laramie, please do so. Like so many other forts around the nation, this is a gem of American history, something that is definitely worth coming out to see. Definitely off the beaten path, a fun little drive out here, and definitely recommend you guys coming out here.
Definitely.
So, for sure. Well, as always, until next time, we'll see you in the field, and of course, ride hard.